Okay, so for this video I'm going to talk about your final project. Hopefully you've gotten my comments back and you probably have gotten the go-ahead, or maybe you need to answer a couple more things before proceeding into your final project. Alright, this final project, the purpose of this is to actually go out and do real-life testing, or at least some testing that would replicate what I would expect you to do when you're in a programming job. And we're going to cover a couple of different things: branch coverage, section of code, and I'm going to add another testing type called mutation testing, which we'll get to in a moment. Before I go in and delve into these different sections, I do want to point out one thing. This project description is very short. It's only a page, and I have it due on December 2nd. That means you have all of October and all of November in order to do this project. The reason for that is not so much that I expect you to be actively working on it, is that there will be certain times where you're waiting for people to respond in your project, or you're trying to get access to some piece of code, and that just can take time. And that's why you need to get started now to make sure those roadblocks don't get you tripped up towards the end of the project. So in other words, get started now. Make sure you can actually interface with the code and you have access to everything. Some projects are very easy to do this and it'll only take you a couple days. That's great. You'll have more time to work on it. Others might take a couple of weeks, and that's okay because I've given you plenty of time in order to accomplish this. Also keep back in mind that this class does not require a final, and I think for what we're doing, it makes a lot more sense to just have a final project, aka your take-home final. This is essentially your take-home final, where you go out and you do a project, a real-life project. Okay, so what am I looking for here? Well, I'm only looking for about 5 different things, and don't be deceived by its shortness. This can take a lot of time to learn to actually perform these operations, because you'll probably have to learn a couple of tools and how they work. And that's okay. That's part of this project, is actually learning pragmatic tools. So first off, step 1, you need to isolate what piece of code you're going to test, or maybe you're going to test the entire project. Once you've isolated that code, run tests to cover the following for each method that you have decided to choose from. Maybe you have a collection of 5 or 10 methods, or maybe you have 2 or 3 objects you wish to fully test. Once you have all those test code, you want to go in and actually give a report about code coverage and branch coverage. Once you've done those tests that hopefully have covered code coverage and branch coverage, number 2 is explain, in the section of code that was not covered, please explain why you didn't get to it. There are actually legitimate reasons why you may not have gone to it. Maybe it'll be something that will be covered in a systems test and doesn't make too much sense to do in a unit or an integration test, and that's perfectly fine. Instrument your code and provide automated report of code coverage and report the results. There are many tools that do this. You do not have to use this Maven Cobertura tool. Maven Cobertura is actually very good for Java applications, so if you have a C# application, I would probably recommend against this unless they've actually modified Cobertura to use C#. But let's go ahead and take a quick look at what I'm looking at. So over here is a website of at least an example of the report. The report's just going to be this. It's not going to be all these annoying advertisements and whatnot. But for example, let's say if you have an order save exception class, it'll tell you line coverage. You were able to get through about 66% of the lines, but no branch coverage here because there is none. Tells you a little bit more about Maven, how to do it. Another example is maybe you have another object.order. You're able to get 60% of the lines and half the branches. That's pretty good. Now this example is very trivial. I do expect there to be many more lines, hundreds of lines, if not thousands, and branch coverage probably will be at least 50, maybe 100, but it all depends. I'm just throwing out numbers to give you a general idea. It doesn't necessarily mean you need to have 50 branches, but you probably will be. What's nice about Cobertura is it actually tells you which lines of code were not executed, so you could tell you 0 tests got here, 2 tests were able to get to that line. And it does go through at least this website to tell you how to set that up. You don't have to use Cobertura, but it may be helpful for your project. If you're using C#, please go ahead and use whatever tool Microsoft has provided. 3 is identify any tests that overlap. This should be pretty apparent from your instrumentation. Is the overlap necessary, or is there a way to minimize the number of tests? We don't want tests to take too long, so if you can actually trim down some tests, that's actually a good benefit. But on the flip side, sometimes it's a good idea to have overlap testing. Maybe they're testing different code paths that still touch on the same thing, and that's perfectly fine. Number 4. So first one, you want to add tests, make sure they do code coverage, branch coverage. Number 2, come up with a tool that actually reports back your instrument, the code coverage, branch coverage. 1 and 2 will probably go back and forth a while because you need to get your code coverage, branch coverage up. What's the percentage? 80% is a very good mark. Generally, you want to aim for 90 if you can do it, but again, it depends on your project. If it's a heavy GUI base or something that you want to do during systems testing, maybe the percentage doesn't need to be that high. But if it is a basic input-output mechanism where you can really simulate the inputs and output, you probably should be able to get near 90%, if not up to 100. Again, depends on your project. Just make sure you explain why you couldn't get the percentage higher or not. And that's perfectly fine. That's normal. So 2 is the instrumentation, 3 is identifying any test overlaps. Maybe you can trim them down or justify why you need so many tests. The point of number 3 is to make sure you do understand why a certain test is necessary and what does constitute a good test. All right, number 4, we're going to talk about mutant testing later, but mutant testing is a way to test the tests. Essentially, you're going to find out, are your tests sufficient? And we're going to perform some mutant testing on your test suite. So we'll come up with a mutant test suite to test the correctness, and then you will need to explain to me why you think mutant testing is sufficient. We have not talked about mutant testing, so if this is new, you haven't looked at it, and that's fine. You have plenty of other work to get done before we even get into mutant testing, so please go ahead and get started. But do realize when we start mutant testing, it will be required for this project. Number 5 is making sure you package it up correctly. Your report should have a table of contents with all the sections listed previously. Please provide a narrative of what the suite are doing and how and why. In other words, I want to hear a story. Tell me the story of how it began. You don't have to, this is how we started the test, this is where it went, and this is why we're going along. Make sure to cite your test cases so I can link what you're saying to your code. I need to be able to inspect your code to see what you did. If you're going up on GitHub or something, if you're actually able to commit back to a repository, especially if you forked a repository, then giving me that repository is great because then I can see which code exactly you have committed. Otherwise, you need to make sure you list out which sections of code you have tested and put in. Turn the final report in Blackboard, which should include how I can inspect the code, and the due date December 2nd. Again, you have over 2 months to complete this. Make sure you get started now. Make sure you get the access you need, because if you don't have access, you need to go find a different project and start there. No teamwork. Your work must be your own. Now, when I say that, I mean no teamwork with other students. Obviously, you're working with a team out on the internet on a certain project. If you need help from them, please go ahead and reach out, but they should not be writing your tests for you. They should not be running the Cobra True results for you. You need to run that. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me.